Academica Media. Welcome to Teach the Way They Learn, expert insight on educating all students. And now your host, Liliana Salazar.
Welcome, welcome, welcome to another edition of Teach the Way They Learn by Academica Media. My name is Liliana Salazar, and I am so happy to be the host of this amazing monthly podcast. The mission of this podcast is to discuss teaching strategies and how they can be the most effective in reaching all groups of students. This podcast will challenge you to put aside tradition and comfort levels and encourage you to embrace different techniques that might be more beneficial for all students. There will be times where it will only be me, and there will be times when I will have phenomenal participants to share their experiences in improving academic outcomes for all students. And this time around, I've got an amazing guest with us. I have the amazing Dr. Aileen Marty. And I just want to tell you just a little bit about how phenomenal Dr. Marty is. She is an expert in infectious diseases and disaster medicine. She served as a naval officer for 25 years and has more than 40 years of clinical and research work in the fields of tropical and infectious diseases, public health, outbreak response, and mass gatherings. Marty serves as a public health advisor for the South Florida community, which we'll talk a little bit about now. She also works with the World Health Organization and has responded to disease outbreaks around the world, including Ebola, Zika, and most recently, COVID-19, serving as an advisor for the South Florida community. Marty is a co-editor-in-chief of One Health, the official journal of the International Federation for Tropical Medicine. And I know what you guys are thinking. I know my listeners are thinking, what are we doing with a doctor on your podcast, Lily? It's always educators. But I felt it was so important to have Dr. Marty on because the pandemic made such a significant impact on how our children received their education. So I felt that it was extremely important to bring Dr. Marty to our podcast, who, by the way, was an extreme support for us at Academica when we were going through the pandemic and how we needed to make sure that we had protections involved for our employees, for our students, as a result of COVID. But I thought it was extremely important to bring her to talk a little bit about where we are with the pandemic, where we are with COVID, what's going to be happening in the future, what are things that we should prepare for. So it's very educationally relevant. And I just can't stress enough how absolutely honored I am to have Dr. Marty on the podcast this month. Dr. Marty, do you want to just say some welcome thoughts to our listeners?
Well, yeah, thank you very much for that incredible introduction, Lily. It's always an honor and a privilege to be with you. You are a mover and a shaker on this earth, and you also have a phenomenal sense of humor to add to whatever you're discussing, and that just makes it really fun to work with you.
Thank you so much. So, Dr. Marty, I want to start just with the basics because, a lot of our listeners are educators, administrators, parents, and I just want to talk, just if you could give us an overview of how we got to the pandemic. Like, what happened? I felt for me like it was from one day to the next, all of a sudden, we were in pandemic mode. The statistics from the pandemic are quite alarming with so many that passed away. And just give us a little history about how we got there and where we're at right now.
Right. So this is, that's a big question. You've asked a lot of parts to it.
Mhm.
I think that the first thing, especially since we're dealing with educators who, and one of the things that we learned from Socrates many, many thousands of years ago is at first we have to define our terms, right? So that we're all speaking the same language. And I think that's one of the biggest problems with the COVID pandemic is that there is a complete misconception as to what that word means.
I agree.
Right. So the word is not, a zombie, a zombie apocalypse. That's not what the word means. It simply means that an outbreak of a disease is happening in multiple continents And that's it. That's all it means. And and to be an outbreak, of course, it means that a disease is happening at a rate that's higher than the background endemic rate for something.
Okay.
So there's lots of pandemics going on all the time. There's lots
Wow.
of, for sure, but they're not scary. And the reason they're not scary is because they're manageable. And as soon as you start to understand the words and what they actually mean, we can step back and talk about what happened with what we call COVID-19, which of course is the disease or set of disease symptoms that people can manifest if they get infected with a virus called SARS-CoV-2.
Okay.
Right? Now, so let's step back to January of 2020, when the World Health Organization and citizens that were knowledgeable in this field were alarmed by an increasing number of very seriously ill people with a horrible pulmonary infection, which was the initial way we recognized, and really the most dramatic way in which we recognize that this virus can attack people. And so in January, the World Health Organization declared a public health emergency of international concern.
Got it.
And that means that's following the rules, right? So again, understanding the terms, that basically says something is developing that is spreading to multiple countries, because it's already in multiple countries, and it's going to overwhelm the public health care system. That's all it means. And that means you have to act. It's telling countries you have to act to keep this from becoming bigger and more people dying and suffering. So nobody that should have been really doing what they needed to do was paying enough attention. So a lot of leaders in a lot of countries didn't blink an eye when the World Health Organization said, this is a public health emergency of international concern. They didn't ramp up the defenses that they needed to. So the numbers of people and the numbers of places started to spread and became very alarming. And in the US, we became particularly alarmed when all of a sudden Italy was having this overwhelming number of individuals in their ICUs. And as by March, when that, by the way, the WHO does not declare pandemics. There's no such thing.
All right.
But because people weren't paying enough attention, they use that word, which is emotionally charged and frequently misunderstood, as I've already pointed out.
Yep.
And therefore, they quote unquote declared a pandemic in the beginning of March, right?
Got it.
And then nations overreacted. So we went from not reacting appropriately to closing down everything in ways that were a little bit, so it was an overcorrection, right? But so if you're asking me what's happening now, by the definition of what is a pandemic, we're still in it.
Got it.
Right? For SARS-CoV-2. By that definition. But in terms of going about our daily lives and the safety for ourselves and the risks to ending up in an ICU or worse, right? Those have dropped dramatically. And that's because we now have a huge portion of the population with immunity. We have established herd immunity, in part from people who were infected and survived, and in part from people who were properly vaccinated. So, and many people who had both vaccines and infection, so that there is so much immunity that the odds of ending up so ill that you need this incredible level of critical care has gone down. And therefore, it's no longer a public health emergency. And so it hasn't been a public health emergency now for quite a while. not just by the World Health Organization saying it's not, but the United States as well. And that means that when we have cases of COVID, which we do, and when we see people that we have to hospitalize, which we still do, including right here in South Florida, we have the wherewithal so that that person's chances of doing well because of the antivirals that we now have, because of the techniques that we've developed for supportive care for these individuals, is gotten so good that the survival is completely different, and it's much, much improved. The virus is still contagious. It's a very contagious virus. So in part of the answer that I didn't give you yet is to talk about the reason it spread so fast and was so alarming. So if you look at some other viruses that have spread or have caused some degree of alarm, you have to always consider how contagious is something. Because, right, for example, the common cold, as a school teacher, how often do you get a common cold from being around the kids?
Right? And my first year of teaching, I felt like it was every week, Dr. Marty.
Exactly. So, and that's highly contagious, but not highly dangerous, right? Miserable, but not dangerous, right? Okay. So when you have something that is highly contagious and significantly dangerous, which is what we had with SARS-CoV-2, we wind up in these public health emergencies. Okay. Now, if you compare some other really bad coronaviruses like MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, which is a kissing cousin of SARS-CoV-2, that killed 33% of the people it infects. COVID only kills about 4%, right?
Wow.
And even less now.
Right.
But MERS wasn't as big a deal because it wasn't anywhere near as contagious. And if you, like, for example, we've been hearing a lot lately about the highly pathogenic bird flu.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that because I know that the listeners would want to know about that as well.
Exactly. And the way that virus has to get into cells in our noses, the noses of adults, we don't have very many of those receptors. So it's very hard to get infected with that particular type of influenza, the H5N1, which is this highly pathogenic one. And that's why you only see it mainly in people who are working very closely with infected animals. That's not to say we shouldn't monitor it, because especially with RNA viruses, and influenza and SARS-CoV-2 are RNA viruses, they don't proofread as well as DNA viruses. So they make more mistakes, and therefore they mutate a little faster. So it is possible for that virus to mutate and adapt and be able to use those upper airway receptors, the ones in our nose and pharynx, and then become more serious. But here's the thing, and here's the funny thing, right? Okay. It's the way life works, right? When it changes, it's also to become more infectious. It's also more likely that our immune system will be able to handle it better.
Wow.
So one of the reasons it's so deadly for people who do get it is because when it infects you deep in the lungs where we have those receptors, and there you don't have as ready a defense system as you do in the upper airways.
Got it. So I have I was taking notes as you were speaking because so many more other questions popped up when you were talking. I guess I sort of have a concern though, right? Because the fact that the World Health Organization, stated in January 2020, we have a public health emergency. There is a public concern, and our countries, our world just did not respond to it. Do you think that as a result of what we went through with COVID-19, that now countries are going to pay a little more attention to, the World Health Organization? Because I don't know, if I were, again, it'll never happen, but if I was ever a world leader, I would definitely be paying attention to the World Health Organization. Do you think that as a result of that, that's why it became an actual, to say the word that, that so many other people use, a pandemic. So tell me where the World Health Organization is now, and I know you're a very big part of that, in regards to these public health emergency and countries understanding how important it is to listen to them.
So, this is a challenging question. First of all, I would vote for you to be a world leader. That would be great.
I would only take care of children and dogs. That's the priority. That would be my running ticket, right? Children are the priority, and then dogs are our second priority.
Yeah. So, but in terms of what nations should have learned, we have a whole, huge set of new ideas of how to manage pandemics, right? How to manage a public health emergency so that we get up to speed sooner. But part of me, while I should be very enthusiastic about lessons learned and how we move in the future, I've been through this cycle before. I remember way back in the early 2000s after the anthrax scare, and I was working for the Department of Homeland Security, and we had set up these incredible response networks and trained teams to handle outbreaks of all kinds, and had pre-positioned this national system of materials and respirators and all the things that
Wow.
would have been incredibly valuable during this outbreak. But over time, since we had stood all that up in the early 2000s, people are like, oh, we don't see any dark clouds. So why are we paying to have these teams trained and this equipment ready all over the country? And so unfortunately, we as a species, we tend to have a little bit of a short-term memory. And I think probably what would really be beneficial is if we forced our politicians to constantly be retrained on those lessons that we've learned, just as a matter of course, so that it's not, we don't end up in these kinds of situations that we found ourselves in without the wherewithal that we had built up and then let go to nothing.
And it's so interesting that you say that, because when we were all here, like I remember that that the country shut down, we were all isolated within our homes, we were quarantined within our homes. My husband and I would have I'll be very honest with you that even though it was a very scary moment in my life, and I think in many people's lives, we were relying a lot on you. We were constantly calling you and so on. It had been a while since my whole family had been in my house, and we had literally spent some quality time together. So it's like I was very afraid for what was happening in the world, but I was just so appreciative and thankful that I had my whole family with me again. So it's just interesting how the pandemic was very scary, but at the same time, I think sort of built family up again, or what family tends to look like. Definitely, I think that when you're talking about, having being in constant communication with our politicians, I think that is so important. I think that in general, we quickly forget these things, and then we're a part of the society where okay, well, it hasn't happened in 6 months, it hasn't happened in a year. I mean, soon it's probably going to be like people aren't even going to remember the pandemic. And so I agree that I feel that we constantly, when we are speaking with our politicians, that we do have that voice, and we constantly need to remind them, listen, just because it's not at this level anymore does not mean that it won't happen again. And we should be very much more well prepared, because I was shocked, Dr. Marty. I was shocked that the country shut down. I was shocked that we were in this situation. I would have never thought that this country and so many other countries would have let it get to this point, because in my very naive brain, I thought that, we're prepared for anything in this, especially in this country, we're prepared for anything. And so just to tell you, I was very shocked, and I'm sure I wasn't the only one, that it just grabbed us, even though that public health warning came out in January. It really it was from one day to the next. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do, and I think that, and I don't think that the general public knew. I think that there are a few good things that the public has learned. They've learned to distinguish a virus from a disease. That's starting to be a reality, which I think is really important, because there will always be people who get infected with a germ and get nothing. That's actually not an uncommon thing. And then other people will get a mild, moderate, or severe or deadly disease from the exact same thing. But in terms of like things like the strategic stockpile that we were talking about, those things we had come up with revenue neutral kind of ways of managing that. The biggest problem is the logistics. For example, in Florida, we had strategic national stockpiles here, back in the early 2000s, where we would, at a discount rate, as things become expired, before they expired, make deals with local hospitals, et cetera, so they would get those supplies for less than they would pay for them, and they would use them up, and then we'd buy new ones, right? So that we kept the stockpile up. We had all these very interesting ideas. And it's really a shame that we're not there anymore. But there's another thing that we haven't talked about that's sort of a bad political effect, and that is because of the confusion and because of the way science works, which a lot of people don't understand. I think it's really, really important to know that science is not a belief. Anyone who says, I believe in science, is not saying anything that means anything. Science is a way of finding out answers, right? And so because we had to base our answers on the available knowledge, because that's the way science works, one day you heard people saying, well, maybe you don't need to mask up. And then later on, the science proved that the masking absolutely helped, right? But in between time, there was all this politics that came in the way. And part of the problem that happened with that was also a lot more anti-vaxxers than we had before. And that, again, is from not properly conveying the science involved with the risks and benefits of the infection versus the risks and benefits from the vaccines. And that to me is very unfortunate, because these misconceptions have now spread to other vaccine preventable diseases that can be very, very serious, such as the measles outbreak.
Dr. Marty, I absolutely agree with you. I do think that there was a lot, even in the field of education, first we wear masks, then we don't wear masks. So, there were things and again, it was because science was a way of figuring out the answers, and the more data we would get, the more, recommendations would be made. Now let's try this, now let's try that. But I do feel that that message was not clearly, was not clearly explained. And therefore you had all these people like, well, what are they saying now? I mean, is it even science? I mean, they don't even know what they're saying. And I wish that the news medias, because I think that they focus so much on the pandemic, but they didn't focus enough on the science. Even though you were on CNN almost every night, there were a lot of, individuals, experts, doctors such as yourself, trying to get the word of science out. But I think that there was just too much news on, overall the negative of the pandemic, and people not focusing on the science. So I know that we relied a lot on you with the science so that we could run our schools, open our schools, make sure that our children were safe. So definitely on behalf of Academica, we can't thank you enough for everything you did for us and how you helped us, because, we wanted to make sure that we could open schools as soon as possible, but in a safe manner, so that our employees felt safe, but at the same time, our children felt safe as well. So I very much appreciate you explaining that. And I very much appreciate I would almost say, for me, I would almost say like the layman's terms that you used with us today, because even to this day, I still have parents, and that I travel the country to all the Academica schools, and I still have parents that do ask me about, what are we doing with COVID? Is this ever going to happen again? Will schools ever shut down again? Especially parents of students that had children that have disabilities, that population was strongly impacted by the pandemic because, for children that have a very involved disability that require extensive amount of services, for months they couldn't get into a school, and they couldn't get their therapies. And so I have a lot of those questions, and a lot of those parents are always telling me, is this ever going to happen again? And I guess maybe that you did mention that to some degree, if we don't pay attention to these public health emergency and these public concerns, it could happen again, and that there are times that it has happened. So as we close out as we close out this session, any final thoughts that you would like to share with our listeners in regards to, just overall public health and how educators can be a part of, and administrators and parents can be a part of supporting and advocating for more public health awareness in our communities and in our schools?
To understand what we need to do for public health, I think it's fundamental that our children are educated in what science is and how science works so that they can interpret the information in the most with the most critical thinking possible. And that means I would strongly advocate for, when you're teaching science, to teach it with the history of science, how the thought has evolved, how we've gotten to understand that this works in a particular way. And I think labs are really important, because when you do laboratory experiments, you suddenly realize that, when you make a line trying to understand the results of your thing, the dots are kind of all over the place and you're sort of estimating. And that helps people understand how science works, so they don't say, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. They do. It's just that it's a stepwise, logical process. So I would very much encourage the education of science as a systematic way of arriving at knowledge.
Well, you're saying that you're going to vote for me to be a world leader, but if I ever become a world leader, you're coming with me, Dr. because I think, to an educator, to a former administrator, the words that you have said about science education are so important. And unfortunately, Dr. Marty, we struggle finding teachers that understand the content of science well enough to be able to teach it. And we have the same struggle with math. So I think that, it's even a step further of, even working with our colleges and universities to see if we could get some type of system in place where our science educators can participate in professional learning and even mentor, have some actual, scientists work with our educators to help them get that language and that content to be able to give sound instruction, because we very much struggle with that. But I think that this is a great way to end the podcast, and a very and giving our listeners something to work on, something to think about. Again, I don't think we ever, I think when we get to the point in this life, many times we'll say, what has happened in your lifetime that is very significant, right? What a world thing has happened, and certain people, like your mom has definitely lived through significant things because of her age, certain people can say, I've lived through, the bombing of Pearl Harbor. I've lived through the Holocaust. I've lived, and I really feel that this, that time in life, that March 2020 is going to be something that, at least our generation is always going to remember, because I always say our world shut down. And I never, ever would have thought, Dr. Marty, that our world would have ever shut down. So if this is one of the things that we need to do, I think that we very much need to push for it. I can't thank you enough, really, from the bottom. I know how busy you are. You are so famous. You are so important in this world. And the fact that you took, 25 minutes of your time to be on my very little podcast, it means the world to me. So thank you so very much. I love you so very much. I love your family so very much. You know that very well. Your daughter is one of my best friends. Your mother is one of my mentors. But I can't thank you enough. And Ross, thank you for as always producing the show. And Ross, wasn't it an amazing podcast? I mean, like, literally, this one was like, this one is probably going to be one of the top rated ones. So thank you so much. And to all
Thank
of our
you.
listeners, as I always say, just always remember that if we cannot, that if our students are not learning how they need to, going through the process and being able to learn, then make sure that we are teaching the way that they learn. I'll see everyone next month. Thank you, Dr. Marty.
Thank you. Pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye.
The views expressed on the preceding program have been those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of Academica, its clients, staff, affiliates, or advertisers.